Under the pale February dawn of 1945, the town of Remagen lay shivering beneath a crust of frost and fear. Smoke still curled from chimneys that hadn't seen fuel in weeks. Windows were shattered, roofs half collapsed. A line of women and old men trudged down the cobbled street, clutching tin cups and empty kettles, watching as the first American armored vehicles rolled into view. The thunder of engines echoed off ruined walls, Sherman tanks, jeeps, trucks, all marked with the white star of an army that had crossed the Rhine. The war had reached their doorstep. Mothers clutched children closer, expecting looting or retribution. Instead, what they saw stopped them cold. A young American sergeant climbing down from his jeep, unscrewing the top of his own canteen, and pouring steaming coffee into an old woman's trembling hands. The soldiers had been fighting for days, many without sleep, yet the smell of roasted beans filled the air like a miracle. It was not just warmth. It was humanity spilling back into a world that had forgotten it. A corporal from Kentucky handed his last ration tin to a barefoot boy smiling awkwardly through exhaustion. "Go on, kid," he muttered. "Ain't much, but it's hot." The boy's eyes widened, the cup shaking as he tasted coffee for the first time in his life. Behind him, rubble glistened with morning frost, and somewhere in the distance the church bell clanged once before falling silent again. To the Germans, these Americans were an enigma. Propaganda had painted them as monsters, wild, merciless invaders who would burn villages and execute civilians. Yet these men, their uniforms stained with mud and oil, seemed ordinary. Some even laughed softly as they passed out chocolate, biscuits, and precious brown packets marked U.S. Army Coffee Instant. The disbelief spread like a rumor across the town. By noon, civilians whispered to one another that perhaps the war was truly ending, not just in gunfire but in compassion. The coffee itself had traveled a long road to reach this moment. Roasted in Chicago, packed by workers in New Jersey, and shipped across the Atlantic in convoys braving U-boats, it was as much a weapon of morale as any rifle. Each small tin contained not just caffeine, but a taste of home, the scent of kitchens far from the front. For American troops, coffee was lifeblood. They brewed it in helmets, drank it before assaults, even mixed it with snow when water was scarce. Engineers had designed field stoves and GI coffee kits to make sure the brew could follow the army wherever it marched. And now, for the first time, that symbol of comfort was being shared with the defeated private. Edward Sloan of the 9th Armored Division wrote in his field diary that he had never seen such hollow faces. He described old men saluting out of habit, children staring at the jeeps like animals emerging from hibernation. "We gave them coffee," he noted, "and they cried." What began as a spontaneous gesture spread from platoon to platoon in every captured town along the Rhine. Andernach, Sinzig, Koblenz. The same scene repeated, GIs pouring hot coffee into chipped cups. German civilians murmuring thanks they barely knew how to speak. But beneath the kindness lay exhaustion. These same soldiers had witnessed atrocities in the Ardennes, liberated camps, buried friends under snow and fire. Their act of sharing was not naivety, it was defiance. They refused to let hatred define them. Captain John Reynolds, commanding a supply convoy near Bonn, told his men that the real victory is not taking cities, it's proving we're better than what we fought. His words echoed through those final months as coffee, of all things, became a language of peace. In bombed-out villages, American engineers rigged field kitchens to heat water for both soldiers and civilians. The scent of coffee drifted through shattered doorways. German women, cautious at first, began offering bread in return, coarse black loaves baked from whatever they could scavenge. An unspoken exchange began, bitterness for warmth, guilt for mercy. The front lines blurred into moments of fragile humanity. For some soldiers it stirred conflicting emotions. Sergeant Harold McCarty wrote home that he felt strange feeding people who might have cheered when we were bombed. Yet as he handed coffee to an old man clutching a cane carved from birchwood, he realized vengeance would serve no purpose now. The man whispered, "Danke, Amerikaner," his voice shaking, eyes filled with disbelief. That simple thank you was heavier than any medal. Word spread through the German countryside faster than leaflets. Civilians began approaching the GIs cautiously, waving white cloths, asking for nothing more than warmth. "They thought we'd shoot them," recalled Corporal Lewis Phelps, "but we gave them coffee instead." To those who had lived under years of lies, the gesture shattered everything they'd been told about the enemy. In one village near Linz, American medics set up a makeshift aid station inside a half-ruined school. Locals brought buckets of snow to melt for water. An old piano stood against the wall, missing half its keys. One evening, as the soldiers brewed another pot, a German nurse began playing a slow, broken melody. Beethoven, barely audible over the wind. The men fell silent. One poured coffee for her, the steam rising between them like a fragile bridge. The irony was not lost on anyone. Just months earlier, both nations had fought across oceans and continents, driven by propaganda that dehumanized the other. Now, amid ruins and ash, one shared act was restoring dignity faster than any treaty. The GIs joked that they were winning Germany with caffeine, but the truth was deeper. These were young men who had seen too much death. Sharing coffee wasn't charity, it was survival of the soul. German civilians began collecting empty tins, polishing them, using them as cups, flower pots, keepsakes. Children carried them like treasures. Some even scratched their names onto the metal. Anna, 1945. To them, the tin symbolized not defeat, but the first glimpse of kindness after a long night. For the Americans, the sight of those battered faces drinking their rations was a quiet reminder of what they were fighting to protect, not conquest, but the idea that mercy still had meaning. By spring, as Allied armies swept deeper into Germany, the coffee ritual became almost ceremonial. At every stop, soldiers brewed extra, filling battered pots over campfires. Villagers gathered in silence, watching the cups pass from hand to hand. The simple warmth thawed more than cold bodies. It melted the fear that had defined Europe for 6 years. When victory finally came, there were no parades in those broken streets, only the faint smell of coffee lingering over the rubble, rising with the morning mist. It was a scent of ending and beginning, of enemies who had tasted humanity together. If only for a moment, in that fragile peace, a realization dawned across both sides of the wire. Power could destroy cities, but compassion could rebuild them. And sometimes, all it took was a battered tin cup and a soldier's last sip of coffee to remind the world that even in war, decency could still win. By the spring thaw of 1945, Germany lay in ruin, cities flattened, bridges collapsed, rivers swollen with wreckage. The US Army moved cautiously through the debris, its convoys stretching for miles across what had once been Hitler's empire. Amid the thunder of engines and the grinding of treads, an unexpected rhythm emerged. Soldiers heating water on portable stoves, the metallic click of mess tins, the hiss of instant coffee powder dissolving. What had started as an impulsive gesture in the first liberated villages was evolving into an organized ritual. Command posts began allocating small portions of coffee supplies specifically for civilian relief. Quartermasters, pragmatic yet human, noted that morale on both sides rose wherever a pot of coffee was shared. Behind this quiet revolution stood a network of supply officers and engineers who understood the logistics of mercy as well as war. The US Army Quartermaster Corps had perfected ration systems capable of sustaining millions of men across continents. Factories in New York, Chicago, and Detroit produced powdered coffee in staggering quantities. Engineers had developed specialized tins to preserve flavor under extreme humidity and temperature. For troops in Europe, the Type C ration beverage coffee instant was standard issue, compact and durable. It was designed for efficiency, but it became a symbol of generosity. Each packet represented the industrial power of a nation that could afford to share even amid total war. To the soldiers who handed out their rations, it was an act of instinct more than policy. The fatigue of the Ardennes still clung to their bones. Many had crossed the Rhine under fire, watched comrades fall in ruined towns, and now found themselves facing a population as broken as their own nerves. The discipline of the American Army, drilled through years of training and guided by field manuals, insisted that civilians be treated humanely. Officers enforced strict codes against looting or cruelty. Yet what distinguished these moments wasn't rule-book behavior, it was emotion. It was the realization that these shivering civilians, once the faces of the enemy, were human beings stripped of everything but dignity. One sergeant from the 99th Infantry recalled trudging through the shattered streets of Cologne, where hungry families peered from cellars. His unit had orders to secure a rail yard, but when he saw a group of children staring at their campfire, he opened his pack, poured half his coffee powder into a tin, and passed it through the fence. The smallest girl, no older than 8, smiled faintly before retreating into the shadows. "It hit me right then," he later wrote, that victory wasn't just taking ground, it was showing them what mercy looked like. Meanwhile, the Army's civil affairs officers began documenting these encounters. They noticed that towns receiving coffee and food aid experienced fewer incidents of hostility or sabotage. Where there was warmth, there was order. Psychological operations experts noted that a cup of coffee often achieved what entire pamphlets could not. German civilians began viewing the Americans not as occupiers, but as restorers of normalcy. A smell of coffee drifting through a bombed street became a signal that fear was over. On the technical side, coffee was more than a comfort. It was chemistry meeting compassion. Each small pouch contained a blend of dehydrated Robusta and Arabica, refined through vacuum sealing processes pioneered by American chemists in the 1930s. In field kitchens, engineers devised large percolators, capable of brewing hundreds of gallons in minutes. These were mounted on mobile trucks to accompany advancing units. Maintenance teams modified them using aircraft fuel burners when gasoline ran low. Even under blackout conditions, the troops managed to produce hot liquid sanity in the midst of destruction. As American units advanced deeper into Germany, they encountered not just civilians, but surrendering Wehrmacht soldiers. Many of these men, weary and starving, dropped their rifles and collapsed. To their astonishment, U.S. Guards sometimes offered them the same coffee that had been shared with villagers. For those raised under years of propaganda that portrayed Americans as savages, it was disorienting. One captured officer later confessed that the first sip of coffee tasted like humiliation, and then like forgiveness. The psychological power of kindness began to undermine years of indoctrination more effectively than interrogation. In small towns, collaboration between soldiers and civilians began to grow around these humble gatherings. Women brought what little bread remained, sometimes adding roasted barley or acorns to stretch the brew. American medics taught children to sterilize water before drinking, using coffee tins as makeshift kettles. Engineers helped repair pumps and stoves. The line between giver and receiver blurred, and within weeks some villages operated communal kitchens under Army supervision. Coffee, the simplest commodity, became the center of reconstruction before the war had even officially ended. Among the ranks, not all approved. A few officers worried that leniency would make troops complacent. Reports circulated of men giving away too much, endangering their own rations. But morale surveys revealed the opposite. Units that engaged positively with civilians suffered fewer discipline issues and combat stress breakdowns. "A soldier who remembers he's human fights better," wrote one psychologist attached to the 12th Army Group. It was as if the act of sharing coffee steadied the soldier's own sanity. In bombed-out Berlin, weeks later, these lessons carried forward. When the 82nd Airborne entered the outskirts, their first task wasn't to celebrate victory, but to establish order. Food and water were priorities. Yet what civilians remembered most were the soldiers standing in snow-filled courtyards, pouring steaming coffee for anyone who approached. One elderly man, wrapped in a tattered overcoat, reportedly fell to his knees and wept. To him, the cup symbolized more than relief. It meant that the war of hate was finally dying. Technicians who had once produced tanks and ammunition in America were now designing relief containers, retooling assembly lines for humanitarian use. Canned food, blankets, and yes, coffee tins rolled off the same belts that had armed the front lines. Workers etched slogans on the boxes: "For peace, for home." The transformation of war industry into a bridge of compassion reflected the larger shift happening in every occupied zone. The world was learning that reconstruction required not only bricks and treaties, but the steady hum of kindness repeated day after day. The simple technology of instant coffee, born from necessity, had become a moral invention. It dissolved barriers faster than any speech could. As American officers documented these small acts, they began using them deliberately in civil military operations. Plans were drawn for friendship kitchens across post-war Germany, mobile units distributing warm drinks and food. These were precursors to modern humanitarian aid efforts, a concept tested in rubble by weary men who just wanted the killing to stop. By the end of May 1945, the sound of percolating coffee filled the air across ruined towns from the Rhine to the Elbe. The war had ended, but the soldiers stayed to rebuild. German civilians, once terrified, now waved to them in gratitude. A few young Americans left notes behind. "If you remember us, remember this smell." Those tin cups, battered and blackened by fire, remained in homes long after uniforms vanished. And somewhere between the ration lines and the rising steam, the meaning of victory quietly changed. It was no longer about conquest, but about the warmth that could turn enemies into neighbors. Summer came to Germany like an exhausted sigh. The guns had fallen silent, but the silence was uneasy. Across ruined towns and farmlands, the smell of coffee still lingered, a reminder of the strange mercy that had accompanied the conquerors. As the occupation settled into routine, American soldiers and German civilians lived side by side in a fragile truce held together, not by treaties, but by gestures. The morning coffee became a ritual for both sides. At sunrise, smoke would rise from improvised stoves made of scrap metal and tank parts. Children gathered near the GI's camps, waiting for a signal that a pot was ready. It was in these quiet hours, amid the rubble, that the real reconstruction of Germany began, not with bulldozers, but with boiling water and patience. American commanders quickly recognized the power of small kindnesses. Civil affairs officers reported that where coffee and food distribution continued, cooperation followed. Villagers began repairing roads, reopening schools, and cleaning wells under the supervision of U.S. engineers. The same supply lines that once carried ammunition now delivered sacks of beans and sugar. For the American logistics officers, men who had mastered the science of movement, rebuilding a nation through nourishment became their final mission. Rail depots that had once unloaded tanks now echoed with the rattle of cups. It was as though the machinery of war itself had been converted to the machinery of forgiveness. Among the soldiers, the act of sharing never lost its meaning. Many had carried those small tins of coffee from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. They had brewed it in foxholes in the back of trucks, beside graves. When they poured it for civilians, they were also pouring out their memories, grief diluted by heat and time. Some GIs wrote home about the odd peace that settled over them, while serving coffee to former enemies. "It's the one time the world feels right again," one wrote to his mother. You forget who's who. Their humanity, dulled by months of blood, flared briefly each morning when steam rose from a tin cup. The Germans, too, began to change. Suspicion gave way to curiosity. Mothers who once hid their children from patrols began teaching them to greet the soldiers with good morning. Bakers, working with U.S. flour supplies, started delivering bread to the camps. The taste of coffee became synonymous with hope, a flavor that connected both sides through shared exhaustion. For a people who had known nothing but ration cards and fear for years, it was intoxicating to experience generosity from their conquerors. It wasn't grand speeches that softened their hearts, but the ordinary rhythm of decency. Psychologists later studying post-war morale noticed how something as simple as caffeine rituals reduced hostility. The Americans' behavior dismantled years of propaganda more effectively than any formal denazification lecture. In the evenings, as dusk fell over bombed streets, civilians would sit outside with mugs of weak coffee brewed from leftover grounds, talking freely without fear of arrest. The sound of laughter, faint but real, returned to places where it had been outlawed. A few local pastors called it the gospel of warmth, salvation poured from enamel pots instead of pulpits. American troops rotated home, but the pattern continued with the occupation forces that replaced them. The Marshall Plan soon transformed these improvised acts of kindness into structured relief programs. Warehouses filled with U.S. coffee beans were shipped to West German ports as part of aid shipments. The government in Washington understood that morale was infrastructure too, that rebuilding roads and bridges meant little if hearts remained broken. Every cup poured in those first years of peace became part of a psychological architecture that would define a new Germany. The irony was that coffee, long a luxury under Nazi rationing, became the unofficial symbol of freedom. Before 1945, it had been rare, often replaced by roasted barley or chicory. Now American shipments flooded the markets, and people queued in long lines for a taste of the real thing. Small cafes began to reopen amid the ruins. Their walls blackened, but their doors wide. Soldiers and locals sat side by side, separated by language but united by aroma. For many Germans, it was their first direct contact with democracy, not as an ideology, but as an experience of being treated decently. In memoirs decades later, former civilians would recall those first shared drinks more vividly than the battles. One woman from Koblenz remembered a GI who gave her mother his entire week's ration. "She made it last a month," she wrote, "and every morning she said it tasted like America, was strong, strange, and full of life." For that family, and thousands like them, those moments became the first bricks in rebuilding trust. The foreign soldier with a tin pot had done what propaganda could not. He made them believe in humanity again. Even as Germany's cities rose from ash, the symbolism endured. Factories rebuilt with US aid began manufacturing kettles and stoves designed from army field patterns. Coffee houses became gathering points for veterans, journalists, and students, spaces for debate, freedom, and remembrance. Across the Atlantic, veterans told their own stories too. They spoke less about battles and more about the faces of children receiving coffee in crumbling streets. Those memories, tender and haunting, shaped the tone of post-war America's global role, a lesson that strength without empathy is only half a victory. The deeper legacy of those gestures reached into the Cold War era. As tensions hardened between East and West, the memory of American soldiers who shared their rations remained a quiet counterpoint to fear. In West Germany, where US troops stayed for decades, older generations often recalled how those men had once stood among ruins offering warmth instead of weapons. It helped cement an alliance not built on coercion, but gratitude. By the time Berlin was rebuilt, the idea of the friendly American was woven into the fabric of the Republic, born not from diplomacy, but from countless mornings when compassion was brewed over campfire stoves. Looking back, historians often mark the Marshall Plan or NATO as the foundation of modern Europe. But long before any treaty was signed, the groundwork was laid in the small kindnesses of tired men who chose to share rather than scorn. The peace that followed 1945 did not come solely from strategy rooms or political speeches. It came from the steady hands of soldiers pouring warmth into the palms of the defeated, from the understanding that empathy can be more enduring than fear. In the ruins of that winter, enemies became neighbors. And though the war had begun with fire, it ended improbably with the hiss of boiling water and the quiet clink of tin against tin. History would remember the generals and the treaties, but somewhere between the smoke and silence, the world was rebuilt by a soldier offering his last sip of coffee to a stranger who no longer seemed like the enemy.